Well, good afternoon, everybody. Let's see, where did I put my notes? Oh, here they are. I was all excited. I wanted to go up before the last hymn. Then they said, oh, we can't do that yet. But now I'm here, so that's good, I guess. Days of unleavened bread, like any of God's holy days, are absolutely fascinating and a thrill to think about and to talk about and to realize, we know something. That's why we're all here. Why we're all dressed up for, coming before God. And that took something in my father's case. He hated to wear ties. He said it felt like he was choking. And then he found out he had too small of a neck size on his shirt. And I explained to him, it's a tie. It has a knot. Farmers know how to tie knots. You can do this thing. And eventually he figured it out, and he found out if he loosened it just a little bit, it felt better. So formal isn't bad. It's a good thing. I wanted to take us on a little different, I don't know if it's different. It's really certainly part and parcel with the Days of Unleavened Bread. But it is an angle of looking at the Days of Unleavened Bread that maybe we don't think about very often. I think you're going to find it very interesting. Helps us see the whole picture of the events leading to the Exodus, and of course then that being a pattern or a type of Christ's sacrifice, and the trauma that he went through in the course of that sacrifice, ultimately leading down to our time today, and it's the link to our time today. The Days of Unleavened Bread, as they will apply to us as we draw to the end of this age. It's very exciting, it's very scary in many respects, sobering in others, but it is going to happen and we're going to be a part of it. The word Passover is a puzzle for most of the world. And when I say Passover, I'm using Passover in this instance specifically to refer to Passover and the Days of Unleavened Bread as a unit. The Bible does that part of the time. The feast of the Passover, when Christ was 12 years old and his parents always took him down to the feast of the Passover, and when those days were over, they went home. Well, that meant that it was a Passover and Days of Unleavened Bread. So it was called the Feast of the Passover. It's called the Feast of Unleavened Bread sometimes, and you can tell by the context they're lumping the Passover in, just like we do with the Feast of Tabernacles, but we don't always say and the last great day, because it's a package, and they're tied together. So the Passover in the broader sense then is a puzzle for most of the world, for all the world. Let's be frank. Statistically, it's all the world. If there isn't, I think it's 3.5%, you don't have a sample, you don't have a legitimate statistic that challenges the overall statistic. 3.5% of the world does not understand what we understand. They don't understand what the Bible says. 3.5% of 7.5 billion people would be quite a lot. And if we take all of the truly viable and energetic branches of the true Church of God together, we wouldn't amount to a statistical analysis because we don't measure up to 3.5% of the world's population. And you stop and think about that, you realize this is rare knowledge. And yet it's right here in the Bible, as we're going to see. It's a puzzle to the world. The conundrum is that it's a baffling puzzle for traditional Christianity as well, because traditional Christianity has no idea how this divinely commanded festival and the ceremony of Passover that launched it actually made true Christianity possible. They don't comprehend it. Why don't they keep the Passover? Instead, they keep that other thing. It is a dilemma. So we're going to address, and this will give you the title, a Passover puzzle. The Passover puzzle, the rest of the title, put a little colon at the end of Passover puzzle. 4 horses, 10 plagues. 4 horses, 10 plagues. There's your Passover puzzle. No doubt you've watched the Ten Commandments movie starring actor Charlton Heston, and he did a great job as Moses. Therefore, you know about the 10 plagues of Egypt. Now, we know about them because we read them. If you're a millennial or younger, by the way, and you haven't seen that film, you need to see that film. And then go back and carefully read the first 12 chapters of Exodus to see how they portrayed the various aspects and what they left out. But today, millennials don't read as much as they need to, so they need sometimes specific assignments. They do watch films, however. So let me give you a little background, the setting. In the early 1800s BC, I'm not talking about the early 1800s when this area was getting, a major settlement of Americans moving west into the Connecticut Reserve. I'm talking 1800s BC, the early 1800s BC, before Christ. God moved his servant Jacob, who he also called Israel, and his family down into Egypt to escape a famine which God had orchestrated himself. The total number of children and grandchildren of Jacob were between 70 and 80 when you count the family of Joseph. We don't know if Joseph's family was only 4, Joseph, his wife, and Ephraim and Manasseh, or if Ephraim and Manasseh had siblings. We don't know that, but it's somewhere between 70 and 80 in the early 1800s BC of all total Israelites in Egypt. Things went extremely well for about 150 years. You think, wow, 150 years. Well, that's quite a long time. Not as old as America. By 150 years, they had a sesquicentennial of doing well in Egypt. That's before Egypt had a bad name. Just stop and think about that. And you start with a population of 80. Some of you must do population statistics. And you can sort of analyze what would be a very reasonable number, which would be quite a lot in 150 years. Hundreds of thousands, maybe 1 million or more. Maybe a little over 1 million. Could easily have existed by that time, especially since they were thriving. They lived in the Nile Delta. That's up by the Mediterranean, where the major Nile River splits into, I think it's 7 or 8 streams that then go out into the Mediterranean Sea. Just like we have the Mississippi Delta, they have the Nile Delta. And that was the territory of the Israelites. And you think, so what's great about that? Well, grass and fertile soil. A lot of things are great about deltas. So it was a huge blessing to be there. The Israelites populated and prospered in that area, and then came a dynasty change. Now, some conservative historians speculate that that's when the Hyksos dynasty moved into Egypt. They were not the traditional Egyptians, but they came in and took over. And then they had a Hyksos dynasty for a period of time. And it's very possible that would certainly account for the fact that the new Pharaoh, as the Bible says, didn't know Joseph. Joseph meant nothing to the new Pharaoh. Any Pharaoh that was from a dynasty that was indigenous to the lower Egyptians, the lower Egyptians, by the way, are the ones that lived up at that end of Egypt, where Cairo is today, the northern part of Egypt. Egypt, the Nile River is flowing out of the south to the north, unlike almost all rivers in the world, except in Russia, where they flow north into the Arctic Sea, which is not much help as far as shipping goes. But the Nile flows north out of the northern Kenya, Ethiopia, and through the Sudan, and then into Egypt. Sudan and Egypt were ancient Egypt together, and part of Ethiopia sometimes, especially in the days of Noah, because according to historical speculation, well, not speculation, historical traditions, Moses, as a prince of Egypt, led an army of Egyptians, the lower Egyptians, lower because they're at the bottom of where the river is running down to, and the ones up in Ethiopia and the Sudan are upper Egypt. They're upstream. So he went up there and subdued the Ethiopians to the lower Egyptians as, a general. So that's one of the historical claims to fame that Moses did during that first 40 years of his life before he became a sheep rancher. Well, that new Pharaoh didn't remember Joseph anymore, and he didn't know that Joseph had been a nation-saving prime minister during a 7-year famine. That meant nothing to the new dynasty, and the new Pharaoh decided to enslave the Israelites, and enslave they did. They made them all sub-citizens of Egypt. That slavery institutionalized even when the dynasty switched back to a lower Egyptian dynasty. The slavery of Israelites was an institution in the country's history by that time. And the Israelites slogged and slaved for Egypt for 40 years longer than America has been a nation. And we're about 239 almost 240 years a nation since 1776. Add 40 years, 280 years of the Israelites being in slavery. You can see why their thinking was the thinking of slaves. Rebellious slaves at times, because they were Egyptians, or not Egyptians, they were Israelites, and so they didn't put up with things. They fussed and bothered, but they still were slaves for 280 years, just to give you a perspective. They were in Egypt for over 400 years before they were taken out by Moses at God's hand and off into the promised land eventually. When their slavery worsened, the Israelites cried out to God, and he was waiting for that. So he raised up a deliverer for Israel. The man was Moses. Moses was the human star of the real Ten Commandments. He played the role better than Charlton Heston. God sent Moses to demand that Pharaoh let God's people go, and Pharaoh said no over and over. God knew that would happen. So he sent Moses to inform Pharaoh that God would unleash 10 terrible plagues on Egypt and make him let Israel go. And Moses, along with his helper, his brother, Aaron, did that. And as you know, the Pharaoh was reasonably nonplussed for a while. And then he was agitated. And then finally he was defeated before he got agitated again. Thinking about those plagues, I think it's worthy just to walk through them. We did this in a sermon previously in North Canton and Youngstown and over on the Heather and Yon circuit that I have in Wheeling and Pittsburgh earlier before Passover. But just to review quickly, God turned the Egyptian water into blood. Not only the Nile River, but all the standing water too. So they had to dig along the river where water had filtered through the sand where it would be, pure enough to drink. Everybody had to do that, including the Israelites. In one sense, you stop and think about, they had, instead of just the blood along the Nile River, they had the Nile River all around them because they had the different branches of it going off into the ocean. Now that was a massive insult to the god of the Nile River because that was one of the gods the Egyptians worshiped. Then God sent another plague. And that was the frogs, no doubt escaping from the lack of actual water. They moved into the houses where people were, where there was shade, away from the sun. Then God took that away, and they had to clean up, do the hazmat removal of all the frogs. And God infested the Egyptians with lice. Have you ever had lice? We watched a documentary on World War I the other night. Very sad documentary, because by the way, we're in the 100th anniversary of World War I. I think we're near the Battle of Verdun, or maybe just after the 100-year anniversary of that. Well, we were watching it, and they were talking about living in the trenches of World War I, and the men all had lice, constantly plaguing them during that time. The Egyptians had lice far more than even those soldiers would have. After that came the flies. Clouds of flies. Have you ever been talking and a fly or mosquito flies into your mouth? Or up your nose, you inhale? Sometimes that happens to people. We had plenty of flies, and I grew up in South Dakota most of my growing up years, and we had regular flies, lots of them. We had your big house flies, then we had smaller fly, which is probably the kind that the Egyptians had, was the smaller fly. Then we had deer flies. Deer flies were biting flies, and they were nasty. We had clouds of those around us when we were working in the irrigation areas of our fields. But they were plagued with them to where they were just all over them. Where you imagine them, people turn black with flies and livestock going nuts. We had cows, milk cows, that would... the biting flies that landed on them, they would be kicking, which is not fun when you're sitting there milking by hand. And you got to dodge the kick when it comes because she's just reacting to fly biting her on the belly, so we kept an eye out, and we'd swoosh them off the cow's belly while we're milking every so often. And then they're batting you in the head with their tail trying to get the other flies off their flanks. The Egyptians had it far worse than that. We just grabbed the tail and tucked it behind our knee and held it while we milked, and they just had to put up with the bites until we got done. you know. But that was flies. Then flies had to drive their livestock to distraction, but that didn't last for very long because God killed most of it, the livestock. That was the next plague number 5, the livestock disease, where you have the vast majority of your goats and your sheep and your cattle and your camels and your horses die. And of course, you're going to get out there with front-end loaders and bulldozers, and you're going to pick them up, the carcasses, and go and haul them into mass graves that you cut out with the bulldozers. No, you're not. I'll do that all by hand out in that hot sun, or you're not going to get it done because then came the hail. Oh, sorry, I skipped one. Let's go back to the other one that I skipped. The boils. Most of us live in fairly clean environments. We don't tend to get boils. On the farm, we did. Get a cut or a scratch, you get infected, it would build up a boil, a pocket of pus on your arm, or maybe in your leg, depending on where you got cut. Because we're working out in the weather like that, you're going to get nicked from time to time. And you can get a really bad boil. They call those carbuncles, where a boil has a head. It's a pocket of infection or pus, and then there's a head in it, and you want to get the head out, or it'll carry on reinfect itself. But a carbuncle is where you have multiple heads in one. Then they get really big. But the biggest I ever saw was, and I told this North Canton, and I know they want to hear this twice. We had a cow that got a boil. Now, bear in mind, the boils were on the humans and the animals. And they're very painful. It wasn't one of our milk cows, but she was in our corral. And she had a boil right on her hip. You know how a cow has a hip bone that sticks out, especially one that was a cow raising calves? Well, this had a second hip bone. It looked like a hip bone, but it wasn't. It was rounder. But it was the same height as the hip bone, about like that, about that big around. And it was a huge boil. Well, my father did most of our veterinary work himself, and my uncle, but they both looked at that and decided, okay, we better call the vet. So that was a rare case. And plus, it was fun. We got to talk to the vet when he came. And he came out. We roped the cow and roped her around the head and tied her to a post. And then we heeled her, which meant we threw a rope under her heels and pulled her over on the side so the boil was up. And so she was laying on her side, and the vet got over there to go to work. And my brother and cousin and I, we small boys, we want to go and see what it's going to do. And we walked up there, and he looked around, and he said, "Boys, you better move back a little ways. This is going to explode." And okay, so we backed off about 6 feet. Oh, no, go over to the fence. And that was 20 feet away. Really? We wanted to see you do it. Well, you can see it, but just stay out of the road of the fountain. And okay, so we got back, and we were glad, because when he lanced the boil with a knife like a hunting knife, that size of a scalpel, it shot a stream of infection in an arc that went over 15 feet in the air and went flying back and landed right in front of our boots. We were impressed. For farm kids, that is cool. Then we walked up and said, "Now what are we going to do?" "Well, we're going to disinfect it," meaning what is he going to do? "Disinfect it, and you guys keep an eye on it for her, your dad and uncle, and make sure that she gets well." So we did, and she did, and all was good. Now, the Egyptians had a plague of boils. They had livestock with boils like that, lots of them. They had boils all over their bodies. They didn't feel like going out and lancing the livestock's boils. They were like Job. In Job, you remember reading about Job, because God gave him boils all over his body, and he sat in a pile of ashes, which was cold ashes, which are one of the softest things he could sit on, because where he sat had boils. The Egyptians all had boils like that. The Israelites didn't. They didn't get the fourth plague, which was the flies. They just got the first 3. You imagine the boils. That didn't put the Egyptians probably in a very happy mood. I can understand why. Next came the hail. And we're not talking about small hail, but major hail. This was a plague of hail. I remember, again, where we grew up, we were in hail territory. Hail requires updrafts. That means cliff faces. And we had one right at the edge of our farm, about 200-foot cliff face. And as you get water droplets coming down through layers of moisture up in the sky, you get water droplets forming in a warm layer, dropping through a freezing layer. It freezes it, and then if it hits an updraft, then it blows that little droplet that is now a tiny ice cube, tiny, tiny one, back up where it gets wet again, and it comes down and up and down and up and down and up until it gets to be the size of a quarter to a half dollar. And by that time, with the updrafts, you end up with a thunderstorm that will come with 50-mile-an-hour winds. And we got those twice on the 7th of July in 63 and 64, 1 hour apart. We had corn, and in those days, we grew corn and alfalfa. Corn that was knee-high by the 4th of July was considered first-class corn in those days. Ours was shoulder-high by the 7th of July at 3 o'clock. By 4 o'clock, it was knee-high. You just had the stalk there, which meant that you weren't going to get any ear corn from it. We were hoping for the harvest of kernel corn. In other words, instead, we had to let grow back what could grow back, and then we would chop that into silage to feed our cattle in the wintertime. But it meant, really slender years income-wise for two families. They had hail that killed their cattle. It killed any animal left outdoors. It killed humans left outdoors. We had a cousin, my father had a cousin, my uncle, who came to tell us about going bankrupt the following summer after the first hailstorm we got. We didn't feel so bad. He picked up 9 hailstones and filled a half-bushel basket. So they were like this. They killed all his chickens, most of his cattle. If they were outdoors, it killed the chickens indoors. It went through the chicken coop, down through the roof, caved in all of his buildings, and put him out of business. It wasn't a widespread hailstorm. Hail normally is very localized based on geography and then just the right conditions up in the sky. And he happened to have the wrong farm in the wrong place. And that was the end of his farming. It was interesting as he told us about one disaster after the other. That was the final disaster of the summer. He said, if you think that was bad, you should have seen what happened next. Then he finally came to the hail story. Egypt was worse because it was all over, all the way up and down the Nile where most of the population was, except in the Delta, because the Israelites were there. That was plague number 7. Number 8 was the locusts. And you think, what are locusts? They're grasshoppers. Big, hungry, mean grasshoppers. And they have plagues of grasshoppers even now, periodically, in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And it has to do, I guess, with the ideal conditions for grasshopper hatch in the spring, and then you get this big cloud of grasshoppers that get blown by the wind, and God just blew them in. When I say locusts, our grasshoppers are large ones, are about 1.5 inches long when you discount the little flippy part of their tail, of their wing. Their grasshoppers start at 2 inches, and from what I've seen, they go up sometimes to 4 inches or more. And they're big around, huge appetite. Anything green that was left from the hail, and even what the hail had knocked down, the grasshoppers ate. You read about it in the plagues. That would be chapter 10 of Exodus. And then God turned out the lights. Complete crop failure, nothing left except what little they had stored in their storage units that didn't get destroyed by the hail. And then they had 3 days of thick darkness. Not even their LED lights worked. Their Braille lights did work, however. Braille lights. That's the only thing they had. That had to be terrifying on top of all these other things. Then the big plague came, and that was the death of the firstborn. And that's when Passover was born too, because the Passover was when the Israelites would be passed over. If they obeyed God and kept the Passover, they would be indoors. They would have slaughtered the Passover lamb they had selected 4 days earlier. They would paint some of its blood on their doorposts and lintels. So that would mean the death angel passed over that house. Literally, that's where the term Passover comes, is passed over it, went on to someplace else. And they would be indoors as a family or a couple families together eating the Passover lamb, just like God ordained in Exodus chapter 12 when he instituted the Passover as one of their first annual feasts or appointed feasts, meaning seasonal feasts in that sense. And that was the time of the Passover beginning. And it was the death of the firstborn in Egypt. It was a terrible, tragic time. There's an interesting verse, and I don't know, I've read this particular year for some reason, this verse, and thought about it more than other times. See, it's in Exodus chapter 12, what am I saying? Exodus chapter 12, and it's verse 30. So the death angel came over, and all the firstborn in Egypt died. Not just the children. If a parent was a firstborn from their family of origin, that parent died too. If both of them were firstborn, they both died. If the cat was a firstborn kitten of its mother cat, it died. And any of the livestock that had been protected somehow in barns or something that didn't get destroyed by the hail or by the livestock disease, if there was a firstborn among any of the livestock, sheep, cattle, goats, what have you, camels, that firstborn one went down dead. That was a terrifying plague. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. And try to imagine the impact of this. I think it's important. When we go into God's annual holy days, there are events that we are either foreshadowing, or events, in this case, we are commemorating, because the Passover commemorates and foreshadows. We're going to see that in a minute. And we need to try to imagine what was it like, in as reasonable a way as we can put it together in our minds so we can appreciate the significance of it. Rather than, lightweight little old plagues that, it's not really that bad. These were devastating plagues. Egypt was being hammered and hammered and hammered and hammered. There was a reason. God was teaching a huge historic lesson. A lot of the Egyptians who died in the process of those lessons, of course, will come back in the Great White Throne Judgment. They'll have a second human lifetime. They'll find out why they died and all the events of things that happened right after their deaths. And I'm sure they will be duly sobered and surprised and motivated by finding out the part they played in history, inadvertently played in history. Because it was the Pharaoh's stubbornness that didn't let them go. Pharaoh held his own people captive while the plagues came. And then more plagues came, and then more, until there were 10. The Israelites were protected from plague number 10 in their homes, keeping the Passover, but Egypt suffered dramatically because of her disobedience to God's way. Egypt was a microtype of how the whole world will suffer by its own choosing in the final days leading up to Jesus Christ's second coming. The Passover was itself anticipatory of his first coming. But there are parallels that come about from the Passover and the Exodus that point to events that will transpire before Christ's second coming, and we'll get into those. It's important to note, though, as to why we're here observing this holy day on this day right now, because as a part of the Godhead, Jesus Christ, prior to his human birth, on behalf of God the Father, freed the Israelites from Egypt, leading them into the wilderness to the promised land. Turn, if you would, to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Now, we know that the historical documentation is in the Old Testament, and here is the validation of that in the New Testament. Validation for those who are skeptical that the Old Testament is valid in any way. But to us, no, it's not validation, it's corroboration. God did what he did in the Old Testament, and he referred to those events in the New. They were real events. They did happen. And there was always a reason why. 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 4. Well, let's read the first 4 verses all together. Moreover, brethren, I don't want you to be unaware that our fathers were under the cloud and they all passed through the sea. That's crossing the Red Sea. That's anticipating of today, same as they crossed the Jordan River, and then fought the Battle of Jericho immediately after for 7 days. And fighting it for the first 6 days was to walk around and shout, "Hey!" at the end, while the trumpets were blowing. And then on the last day, they all shouted together and the walls fell down, and that happened too, by the way. And archaeologically verified of some of the ruins at Kathleen Kenyon was one of the early 1900s archaeologists that excavated Jericho. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, in the sense that they had water to the left of them, water to the right of them, and the cloud, presence of Jesus Christ, was in the cloud above them. So they were surrounded in that sense by water. So it was a symbolic baptism. They all ate the same spiritual food. They drank the same spiritual drink. And they drank of that spiritual rock that followed them. And that rock was Christ. And he provided the water. Now, they didn't go into a desert. The Sinai today is pretty much a desert. In those days, Moses had been a sheep rancher in the Sinai, so there had to be grass. It was a grassland. But when you have a population of people the size of the city of Cincinnati and all their livestock going with them and moving back and forth in various patterns throughout that territory, there has to be a lot of grass, but they especially need water when you have that kind of an encampment. So that was the critical factor of Christ providing the water. But most of them, God was not well pleased, and their bodies were scattered in the wilderness, and they became, for us, examples, in verse 6, to the intent that we should not lust after the evil things that they lusted after. There's some good lessons we need to learn from that. But it was Christ who was leading them. In chapter 5, going back here in 1 Corinthians, just a few pages, to chapter 5, verse 7, we want to look at Paul, the Apostle Paul, validating that the Passover and the days of unleavened bread are fully in force in the New Testament era, fully in force. Verse 6, your glorying is not good. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Now, if he said that to a congregation, or a church rather, that did not observe the days of unleavened bread, it would have very little meaning unless they had a cooking class. And the pastor was teaching the cooking class. And maybe Paul's last name was Child. Don't think that's probably the case, though. Don't you know the little leaven leavens the whole lump? And he would explain them to understand, expect them to understand that. Why would he expect them to understand it? The same reason he expects us to understand it. They kept these days. And they were Gentiles. See, that's the usual traditional Christian argument. Well, they were Gentiles. Paul preached to Gentiles, and they didn't keep any of these days. Wrong. The Gentiles and the Jewish brethren all kept these days. Therefore, they knew what Paul was saying to them. And they knew good and well they were in error in this other thing that is mentioned earlier in the chapter. Therefore, he goes on in verse 7, purge out the old leaven. We did that. We threw all our old leavening away. Whatever we hadn't used up got tossed, and we sent out the bread crusts, into the garbage, feed the mice in the city dump, or whatever. And we purged all the old leaven out of our houses, that you may be a new lump. We know it's not that the leaven is the thing God wants us to get rid of the most. He wants us to get rid of sin. And leavening, sin is like leavening, because when you sin a little bit in one way, then you start to lose your resolve to be faithful to God in another way. And then that brings a third area that you start to weaken in, and you know how it goes. One weak thing leads to another until the whole dike breaks and there's a flood of disbelief and misbehavior. For indeed Christ, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore, let us keep the feast. What feast? The feast of Passover and unleavened bread. Let us keep the feast not with the old leaven or the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And that's what we've been doing this past week. We've been meditating on the meaning of the days, putting sin out of our lives, getting back to what is true, and being genuine And absolutely, the Australians have a term. We use the word genuine. They have a term that I think is probably Aboriginal in origin, fair dinkum. For them, it means genuine. So if you say something that sounds odd, an Aussie will often say, fair dinkum? Meaning, is that true? Is that genuine? So that's one of the little tidbits I picked up at Ambassador College in England. We had about a third of the campus was Australian, so we learned a lot of expressions from different cultures. Let us keep the feast, not with the old leaven or with the leaven of malice and wickedness, with any kind of sin, inner sin or outer sin, either one, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Indeed, Passover and the days of unleavened bread are for our time. Now let's flash forward. Forward into the 21st century, further than we are now. We don't know exactly when Christ's second coming is going to be. We have anticipated it before now. For those who are old-timers, you remember. Lots of people like to sit around and see if they couldn't guess when Christ was going to return. If they couldn't get the day and the hour, then they said, well, at least we can figure the year. Remember 1972? That was one of the great speculations for those who've been around that long. And then others have come up with different years. Well, it can't get any worse than it is now. Well, I wonder if they thought that in Egypt, about after the second plague. It can't get any worse than this now. It got worse. And it will. But let's go back to Matthew 24 and realize where we're moving forward to in our thinking here and drawing some parallels. And you're going to see the parallels are just amazing between the prophecies of the very end and the time of the Exodus and the original Passover. Matthew chapter 24. Skip past it. Here we go. Verses 21 to 22. Verses 21 to 22. Here we are. For then there will be great tribulation. And we pick those two words up to give the title to that time frame. The great tribulation. Such has not been since the beginning of the world to that time, no, nor ever will be. And unless those days were shortened, no flesh would be saved. But for the elect's sake, and brethren, we are among the elect. For the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. This will be an unprecedented era. That doesn't mean that it will not be a non-foreshadowed era or an unanticipated era. We anticipate it. There are a few religions, of traditional Christian denominations that anticipate it a little bit. Well, they don't understand the concepts. They don't keep the holy days, so they're thrashing around in end-time prophecy and not able to put everything together as God, in fact, has it planned. Let's look at the parallels, though. Stop and think about Israel's last years of slavery. It had to be getting very bad. They were crying out to God. It talks about that, in the slavery toward the end. And you think of the way the Israelite slaves were feeling in Egypt, it foreshadows the way the population will feel in the world's final years coming up. We mentioned 4 horses, 10 plagues as a part of the title. This is where the 4 horses come in Revelation chapter 6. Each one had a rider, so it's usually called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, but the horses are introduced before the riders are, as you'll note. God likes horses. I can appreciate that. In addition to raising cattle, we raised horses. Chapter 6 of Revelation. Verse 1, Now I saw when the Lamb opened one of the seals, and we know that Lamb is a reference to Christ as the Lamb. Well, what Lamb is Christ? What Lamb is being referred to when they use that term to refer to Christ? The Lamb. There's only one. It's the Passover Lamb. So you see the connection then right with where we are today in this particular year. I saw the Lamb open one of the seals, and I heard one of the 4 living creatures saying with a voice like thunder, "Come and see." And John, this is a vision John's having that is realer than life and terrified him to no end at times. And so I looked, and behold, a white horse, and he who sat on it had a bow, and a crown was given to him, and he went forward conquering and to conquer. Now, the white horse corresponds, in the minds of the evangelical prophecy buffs, to the white horse that Christ rides coming back. What they miss, though, is the weapon. When Christ returns, what weapon is he carrying? A sword. It seems like it's in his teeth because it goes out of his mouth. It's reference to his word. And he does everything by a command, But he carries a sword. This white horseman carries a bow. Now, I like bows, nothing against them. But it's a counterfeit. It's not the real Messiah. Not by any case. And he had a crown that was given to him, and he went out conquering and to conquer. So what parallels could we see? We look at this and we realize, religious deception. Or deception generally, but especially religious deception. What parallels back at the time of the Exodus could you think of? How about Pharaoh's magicians? Deception. Smoke and mirrors to come up with turning their sticks into serpents. And then the serpent that Moses' staff had turned into ate theirs, and then he picked it up and walked away with all of the snakes in his staff, as it were. And his magicians had nothing. They were charlatans. Smoke and mirrors, as I said. How about the way Pharaoh deceived Moses and Aaron, or acted deceptively? Let's put it that way. I doubt that they were deceived. Acted deceptively by saying, okay, you can let your people go after a certain number of plagues. And then as soon as the plague stopped, then he said, forget it. Deal's off. You don't get to go. Well, Pharaoh was two-faced, double dealing. How about deception? How about looking back at that time, the Egyptian idolatry? And you think, the Egyptians didn't know anything about the true God. They had Horus and, I don't know all the Ammon and the river, the Nile, all these different gods and goddesses. The pantheon of Egypt was huge. I don't know if it was bigger than the Greeks or the Romans, but it was substantial. Lots of gods. Not the one true God, but lots of gods. That idolatry was deceptive for them, wasn't it? You know who else it was deceptive for? What did they do at Mount Sinai? Made a golden calf. That's right. They reverted constantly back to the paganism of the Egyptians. The Israelites carried probably small Egyptian idols with them as they left. Even Rachel and Leah, when Jacob said, we got to leave your dad's place, he doesn't like me. Going way back before there were, they were just having Israelites. The entire tribes of Israel were boys, little guys, little fellows. Then they took off, and what did they do? They took their father's household idols with them because Laban was a pagan. He knew who the true God was, but mostly he was a pagan. And they took them with them. Israel had a penchant for wanting to take the pagan gods of other cultures and make them their own. And the Egyptian idolatry was certainly deceptive to the Israelites, as we know, as the days went forward. Now let's go to verse 3. Then he opened the second seal, and I heard a second living creature saying, come and see, and another horse, fiery red, came out. And it was granted to the one who sat on it to take peace from the earth, and that people should kill one another, and that there should be given to him a great sword. Now this isn't the sword that came on the white horse that Christ was riding when he returns. So this is a sword that is war. This is the war horse. The red horse is a war horse, and the red horseman is a warmonger. What parallels do we see with the Exodus there? Certainly we see Pharaoh's threats of violence. Threats that were taken seriously because they were based on previous violence against the slaves. That's how you keep that many slaves in subjection, is you slaughter some of them wantonly from time to time or at the slightest bit of misbehavior. And that motivates the others for a while. So they were afraid of Pharaoh, and they had right to be. And when we talk about war, how about God's war against Egypt? Remember, war goes both ways. Pharaoh was warring against the Israelites in the way he treated them as slaves, and the threats of violence that he gave Moses and Aaron during the time of the Exodus. But God carried on his own war against Egypt with the 10 plagues. How about the battle of the Red Sea? The Israelites went down into the Red Sea after God blew the wind all night long and dried the sea floor up so they could walk over dry shod. And the Egyptians, therefore, thought they could too, which I'd have to admit, they were pretty brave Egyptian soldiers. As you got walls of water that you're riding down, this canyon of water, and thinking that you're going to get out on the other side and kill all those misbehaving Israelites, and then they get out of the water, or out of the sea channel, and the water comes back upon you. That had to be a terrifying experience. But that was the battle of the Red Sea. God fought it. Egyptians lost. How about talking about war? How about the war on the babies of the Israelites that led to some of their cries, and even led, decades earlier at the time of Moses' birth? They were throwing the Israelite baby boys in the Nile River. And you think, oh, the little baby boys drowned in the river. No, they didn't. They were snapped up by the Nile crocodiles. Bigger crocs than our alligators. They would eat our alligators if they were over there. They would eat them for lunch. That's what the basic crocodile species of Africa is, the Nile croc. It's named after the Nile because that's throughout Africa. They are man-eaters, and they eat people every day in some parts of Africa. Anybody who's not watching, those babies were devoured by the Nile crocs. So they didn't drown. I guess if there's any solace to be taken in that. But it's a sad business, isn't it? Well, let's look at what else is sad. And he opened the third seal in verse 5, and I heard a third living creature say, "Come and see." And I came and saw, and there was a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand. And I heard him say in the midst of the 4 living creatures, those would be angels, the 4 living creatures, "A quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not harm the oil of the wine." Famine, food shortages. You typically don't have an absolute famine, because if you do, then people all starve to death, and then there's not famine anymore because there's no demand on what's left. But this is a famine. Typically is where there's not enough food and people are slowly weakening, and you see that happening. It's happening right now in Africa, northern Nigeria, and a couple of other places because of the armies that are fighting each other. So one of them gets in position, they starve out the supporters of the other. That's always how it's been around the world, for that matter. But in Africa, it seems to be worse because they have no recourse, no place they can get away from the warring factions of these countries. Now you look at how famine is of the end time is looked on or precipitated upon Egypt by the Exodus. The livestock disease. Suddenly you have minimal livestock because God killed them. And they depended on their goats and their cows and sheep probably for milk as well as meat. And they had their beasts of burden that they needed. So you're going to have the serious food famine just from a protein perspective, just that way. And then the hail killed more of the livestock and wiped out the crops. Complete crop failure. Possibly, and you wonder, how could Egypt even survive? Possibly Joseph's forethought had become institutionalized to a certain degree in Egypt, going back, a long time back to Joseph's time. And they had habitually saved grain and stored it so that they didn't completely starve after the Israelites got away. The locusts would come and clean up anything else green that the hail missed. Hail being more localized, the locusts weren't localized. And then you had the death of the firstborn, included the death of the firstborn livestock, as well as firstborn people. So then whatever little bit of livestock is left is thinned out even worse, cutting back on your food supplies for the Egyptians. When you knock out their strike force, which is what Pharaoh led to the Red Sea, Egypt could not project power for a very long time. They were completely defeated as a major nation of that day. It took them a long time to rebuild. They did rebuild, but it took them a long time to do it. God hammered them hard. Famine was a part of it from the residual impact that they were going through. Now, the Israelites occasionally got a little hungry in the wandering in the wilderness, too. We know about that, but then God provided them with manna, and when they got thirsty, he provided them with water. After they complained a lot, and that was not good for them, but they complained quickly. That was a difficulty. Verse 7 and 8. When he opened the fourth seal, I saw a fourth living creature, and I looked, and there was a pale horse, and the name who sat on him is called Death. And Hades followed with him, the grave. And power is given to them to kill a fourth of the earth, to kill the sword with hunger, with death, and with the beasts of the earth. So we see a parallel here. This is the disease epidemics that come. The boils would classify as a disease epidemic. It had to be fatal in many cases. Certainly it weakened them to where others to where they would have died from some of the other events. The livestock disease was a plague, a pestilence on livestock. Because of the famine precipitated by the plagues, you have more diseases that are secondary diseases that the Egyptians would have been experiencing in the course of the Exodus. And then to cap it off, you get the death angel going through, and that's a pestilence in itself. They can't see it, and their firstborn all die in one night. So you see, there are parallels between the time then and the time of Christ, his first coming, and then the lead up to his second coming ahead of us. We are not left sort of out academically looking at the Passover and unleavened bread. We're in the middle of the fulfillments of it as time goes by. We're right here where the action is in that sense. Let's go to chapter 11 of Revelation and look at another series of parallels and even types. Chapter 11, and we want to begin at verse 1 through 3. So I was given a reed like a measuring rod, John writes, and the angel stood saying, "Rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and those who worship there. But leave out the court, which is outside the temple, and do not measure it, for it's been given to the Gentiles, and they will tread the holy city underfoot for 42 months. Aha. A time's time and half a time, 1,260 days and another prophecy, and 42 months. 3.5 years. And that 3.5 years will come. Just because it didn't come in 1972 doesn't mean that it's not coming. It will be here. And I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy. So the Gentiles, that would be the beast power comes and takes over. There's a prophecy in Daniel that talks about that. We won't go into the details, the cross-referencing there. But verse 3 says, I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. 2 witnesses. Yes. These are the 2 olive trees, the 2 lampstands, verse 4. Standing before the God of the earth, and if anybody wants to harm them, fire proceeds from their mouth and devours their enemies. They can call fire down like Elijah did. And if anyone wants to harm them, you must be killed in this manner. And they have power to shut heaven so that no rain falls in the day of their prophecy. And they have power over waters to turn into blood and strike the earth with all plagues as often as they desire. Turn water to blood, stop the rain, strike the earth with all plagues. The 2 witnesses were typed by 2 other witnesses we know of. Moses and Aaron were in historical types of what the 2 witnesses will be at the end of the age. The role of Moses and Aaron will be used again. And these 2 witnesses at the end, and when this time comes, it's fascinating to see that. So the beast, in fact, the beast, being the military political leader, has a sort of high priest called the false prophet who works at his side. They work together. The beast is the one with the authority. Moses and Aaron, in a sense, are a type of even the beast and the false prophet, except Moses and Aaron were the true prophets, and these are the false. So you can see another parallel there. God works in patterns of things, and understanding those patterns help us to appreciate the dynamics in which we live. We are not outside of the existence of biblical events. We're part of them. And we are very likely will live to see these happen. And we never know how long that's going to be. North Korea is threatening right now. I just watched a Drudge report here, or read it during the lunch break. They are threatening to attack with nuclear weapons if the U.S. takes any steps against them. So we'll see. Their last 3 missile launches have blown up on the launching pad, so that's kind of not been as intimidating to others as they would have hoped, I suppose. And they also have, after President Trump's meeting with the current leader of China, they have at least 150,000 troops apparently deployed on the border of China and North Korea. But we have some big tensions going on right now. And you don't know when they're going to launch and lead us into the end of the age. It may heat up and then cool down, or some action is taken that puts a quietus to the rest of it for a while. We've seen that happen. We were watching events coming along up through the late 70s, and it looked very tense. Then Ronald Reagan got elected as president, and he brought a little bit of sense to the office and knew how to deal with the other superpowers in a way that terrified them. Remember the time that he was doing his weekly national radio broadcast? He'd do a 10-minute message that he would give every weekend. So warming up getting the studio ready, and he knew when the light was on and that the mic was on, because he was an old radio announcer from way back. He knew it all. And he said that he pretended to be testing the mic. He said, "Tell the Russians that the bombing will begin in 5 minutes." That was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. The President of the United States would joke about launching a first strike against them, and things began to back down, and eventually even the wall between East and West Germany came down at his request. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And we had, to a degree, a respite of sorts. We slacked off a little bit from the intense events that were leading up to what we could see as being the end, knowing they're not technologies that we had then. The technologies we have now are a lot more sophisticated and a lot more powerful and ubiquitous, meaning a lot more people have them. We are far tippier kind of time now, balanced on the point of a stick. You know how they spin plates up there? We're the plate. How long can we keep spinning as the world situation is right now? So here we have these 2 witnesses being, remarkable parallel, but we want to finish off. They finish their testimony of the beast that ascends out of the bottomless pit in verse 7 will make war against them and overcome them and kill them, and their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city. That'll be Jerusalem, which is called Sodom and Egypt, where our Lord was crucified. So the world of Jerusalem of today is paralleled with Sodom. Well, that's not a very good parallel. And Egypt. And why Egypt? Because of the events of the Exodus. It's going back to that time, in reference to that time. So in that sense, the Jerusalem today is and Sodom and Egypt, all 3, especially including Egypt, are a type of our modern world society. We live in Egypt. Not the narrow Egypt in the geographical location, but the culture, the cultural Egypt of the world. And that's amazing. Now to chapter 12. And a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed in the sun, a moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars, indicative of the 12 tribes. And being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. And another sign appeared in heaven, a great fiery dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. And his tail drew a third part of the stars, or angels of heaven. We know that stars is a symbol of the angels of heaven. And threw them into the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth to devour a child as soon as it was born. And essentially he worked through Herod the Great. Wiped out all the children of Bethlehem up to 2 years old when he heard that the Messiah was born there. What he didn't know is that God had already sent Joseph and Mary with the baby Jesus down to Egypt, of all places, for a place of safety until he said, come back. But Satan was trying to destroy the Messiah because he knows the Messiah will destroy him. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron. When will that rod of iron be instituted? At the second coming of Christ, not the first coming. He didn't rule the nations during the first coming. He had a different mission then, but his mission upon his return is to rule the nations. And her child was caught up to God at his throne, of course, after his crucifixion. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her there 1,260 days, which is 42 months, which is 3.5 years. So the woman here, of course, is Mary, but Mary is a type of the true church of God. Just like physical Israel is a type of spiritual Israel. Physical Israel is the nation, the 12 tribes. Spiritual Israel is the church. And there are other places that bring that particular one out. So in this case, Mary is a type of the true church of God. Not of Christianity in general. Mind you, we are distinct and different. That's why we're here and they're not today. Would that they were. Would that all of Christianity was true Christianity, but they're not. Their day will come. Their eyes will be opened. In fact, the eyes of all the people that have ever lived will be opened. And war broke out in heaven, and Michael and his angels fought with the dragon. Michael is an archangel. With the dragon, meaning Satan, and his angels fought. But they did not prevail, the dragon and his angels, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. One of the other types of the book of Revelation is that Satan is a type, or Pharaoh. The Pharaoh was a type of Satan. He was acting, in a desire to destroy and to continue to persecute the Israelites, just as Satan is trying to destroy the church in the end time, the spiritual Israel. And so Pharaoh was a type of Satan in the role that he played. The two witnesses were faced off against the Pharaoh and his magicians, who were the false prophet and the beast and the false prophet in the end time. They were types of those. Now we go to verse 10. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now salvation and strength in the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, and the accuser of our brethren who accused them before God day and night has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb, again reference to Christ's Passover sacrifice, and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, knowing that he has but a short time. So the bottom line, as we look through these events, we see that we have another time of similar to the era of the plagues in Egypt, the end time prophecies, and that what Moses and Aaron and the Israelites went through then, we will see unfold on a far larger scale in the modern era. Now notice, back, we read over it, but the woman in verse 6 was fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God that they should feed her 1,260 days, the 3.5 years. We look at that as a place of safety, place of protection, is the way we've termed it in the past. And we believe that there is such a place because it says that there is such a place there. There's also a historical fulfillment in the early church when it began to be persecuted by the rising Roman church bad enough in the 300s or so that God sent it off into the alpine valleys and out of reach and out of sight and out of mind of the Roman church, or they would have martyred all the brethren. They martyred many the way it was. But this will be at the end time when that final fulfillment of the place of safety, similarly brought out here. In verse 13, the dragon saw that he'd been cast to the earth. He persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. In verse 14, but the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness, to her place where she is nourished for times and time and half a time from the presence of the serpent. And then it talks about the serpent spewing water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, to carry her away by the flood, maybe a physical flood at this place of protection, wherever it is. We have speculated where we think it might be, but we don't have any solid, specific evidence. It's a little bit more circumstantial, but it still might be there. We don't know. Bottom line is we don't need to know. God will know. He's our travel agent. He's our pilot. He's got the thing, whatever the wings are that he's going to put us in, like probably a plane. That would have been unimaginable back at the time John was writing it, at any time up until the 20th century, that there would be wings that you could carry people away on. And the dragon was in range of the woman, and he went to make war with her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. It sounds like some who repent as the tribulation goes on. Maybe they once knew the truth, like we know the truth now. But they aren't where the protection is during that particular period of time. Not that we're in this to get protected during the Great Tribulation. We gave our lives to Christ when we accepted his Passover sacrifice at baptism. And that means we gave our lives to him. If that means martyrdom, so be it. We don't prefer it, but so be it. We're in here for the long term, brethren. Eternal life in the kingdom of God. We're not in this for comfort or fame. We're here to do the work of God. And we aren't like the rest of the world that claims to follow Christ, but they don't understand him. We try to make it clear, and we've got to try harder. But it is clear to us. God has made it clear to us. Now, here's the lesson about the place of safety and the church being in it. It will happen. It says it right here. Church will be protected. But obviously some of the church wasn't motivated enough to come, and so they're out there for him to go and make war against outside of this protection place. So here's the story. This goes back. We heard it personally from Mr. Waterhouse. That would be Alan's grand uncle, I believe. He was visiting Mr. Armstrong back in the late 70s or early 80s. I think it was about 1980 or 81, when Mr. Armstrong still was at his house in Tucson before he moved back to Pasadena. And they had gotten in the car, and they were being driven out to a restaurant to have a bite to eat. And so Mr. Armstrong and Mr. Waterhouse are talking. You know how Mr. Waterhouse used to envision the prophecies and imaginatively present them, and how the possibilities that they could be fulfilled. It was very exciting and invigorating when he came around to give his 3 to 4 hour sermons. And no breaks. It was just 3 to 4 hours. For those of you who knew, I'm not going to go that long, that's for sure. But Mr. Armstrong said, "Gerald, how do you suppose God will gather all of his people from all around the world and bring them to a place of safety when it's time?" And so Mr. Waterhouse says, so I thought for a minute, and then I said, Mr. Armstrong, I think that just goes to show how great God is. In other words, I don't have any idea, but I don't have to have an idea. God's got that figured out already. And he said that Mr. Armstrong reached forward and slapped him on the knee. He said, "Gerald, I think you're getting it." That's a good lesson for us all. It just goes to show how great God is. And we count on that greatness of God. Our faith is in that, and his providing for us and leading us into his kingdom beyond this physical life we live now, but we have much to do even now. Regarding the place of safety in this passage that we just talked about, and again, it's a prophecy. It's going to be fulfilled. So since it didn't happen when they thought it should happen, then they decided, well, it isn't really a prophecy, and it's not going to happen, and that's nonsense. And people bank too much on their little angle of how things are supposed to be fulfilled. They can get disappointed, especially if they don't understand the truth, understand exactly how it's going to be fulfilled. Another one of our great minds of the past, Dr. Herman Hay, used to be he was one of the first graduates from Ambassador College. In 1951, he graduated. He stayed on as a faculty member then, a brilliant man, prodigious mind. But once he was questioned on this, may have been Mr. Waterhouse that mentioned this as well, but Dr. Hayes reported to have said, regarding the place of safety, those who believe will go, and those who don't won't. Simple as that. How great God is, and those who believe will go. And again, I'm saying go to the place of safety is not our goal. Our goal is God's kingdom, but there's active leadership of God all through this time. The Israelites were told to go out of Egypt, and they went. Then they complained. But that's Israel. And we're all a little bit Israelite. A lot. We're spiritual Israelites. Final scripture, as we look at this, the story of the 4 horses and the 10 plagues, and hopefully you've seen the correlation of the 4 horsemen and the 10 plagues and how there's so many parallels and types and antitypes back and forth between the Exodus and end-time prophecy, that the Passover speaks to us not just of our salvation, but also what God is doing in the world today, where we live. But chapter 18, Israel came out of Egypt. When Israel out of Egypt went, we sing in that one hymn. That's one of the lines. She came out. They carried, as we already mentioned, many of the sins of Egypt with them, their idolatry, the pagan idols, the Egyptian idols, the golden calves, and so on. They carried those with them. And that they shouldn't have done. Now, not all of them carried with them. There were some who were faithful who didn't, but there were way too many who did. So in verse 4 of chapter 18, and I heard another voice from heaven saying, "Come out of her, my people." And we're talking now about Babylon the Great, this whole world system. Initially, Babylon was the evil nation because she took the Jews into captivity. She conquered Jerusalem, burned it, sacked it, and took them all into captivity. The other tribes have been taken into captivity by Assyria. But Babylon conquered Assyria too, so she was the major force. Babylon eventually, the derogative concept of Babylon was eventually transferred to Rome because the various powers that replaced the Babylonian Empire ultimately became the Roman Empire. And the capital was in Rome. By the time of John, when they may use Babylon, in a symbolic sense, they're referring to Rome, not to a rundown little place that was a Jewish settlement, but the old Babylon. But by the time of Peter and Paul, Babylon was still back out in the Middle East, as Peter refers to it in one of his epistles. 30 years later, because Peter and John died in the late 60s, and so, 25 years later, John is writing Revelation, and by that time, Babylon had been transferred to Rome, because Rome had gotten far more vicious after the Roman War, and so the Jews used it that way, and the church undoubtedly did as well for that reason. Come out of her, my people, lest you share in her sins, lest you receive of her plagues. Israel had to come out of Egypt. Egypt is a type of the end-time world of today. Lest you share in her sins. These days are all about putting sin out of our lives. The leavening that we don't eat during the days of unleavened bread are symbolic of our sins. Because sin puffs us up. We read that in 1 Corinthians 5. Lest you receive of her plagues. This is a reference to the 10 plagues of Egypt. You see how everything is woven together, and one thing is anticipatory of another thing, and another thing looks back to the first thing, being in the Exodus we're looking at. So here's our lesson for these days of unleavened bread, brethren. We put leaven out for a week, but we put sin out of our lives permanently. We have to be overcomers. He that overcomes will I grant to sit with me on my throne. Only overcomers in Revelation 22 and 21 and 22. Only overcomers will be in the kingdom of God. That means they overcome sin. They put the sin out of their lives, which is what our leavening is simply a type of, to teach us that lesson. The world is going to suffer great plagues. The worst plague that the world will suffer will actually come later, and it's going to be the lake of fire for the wicked. That's the worst plague. That will end their future, end their existence forever. They will not ever be resurrected if they die the second death in the lake of fire. We don't want to be there, that's for sure. Nobody does if they have any wisdom whatever at all. So here's our lesson. We put leaven out for a week. We need to put sins out of our lives and be overcomers all year long. And we need to come out of the spiritual Egypt, the culture of the spiritual Egypt, rejecting those things that are ungodly and accepted widely by society. We need to question them. what is wrong and what is right, and what at least is not wrong. Some things aren't right, but they're not wrong. We have to come out of spiritual Egypt. We have to come out, in that sense, of our sin-filled society. We don't participate in its revelries and its sins. We live a different life. And that's what it means. That's the puzzle, the solution to the puzzle of 4 horses and 10 plagues.